Welcome to Confessions of a Parent Coach. I'm parent coach, mother of four, and your host, Ann Kaplan. This is the podcast where you will learn that even for parenting experts like me, there is no such thing as a perfect parent, and that fabulous behavior and amazing relationships are right on the other side of that realization. If you're working your butt off to do right by your kid, honor yourself, and go beyond the BS around you, you are my person, and this podcast is for you. Full disclosure, I'm a sometimes potty talker, and we deal with the challenge of raising kids here. This podcast is for grown-ups, so stick your earbuds in and let's do this. Welcome into another episode of the podcast, everybody. I'm so excited to be here again with you this week, and really excited because this is my first episode with my new producing crew. So I feel very fancy. I have a whole new assistant, and all this stuff is happening in a slightly different way that probably no one else will notice except me, but it's exciting nonetheless. And been working with this new crew for about a month now. And I got to say, even though nothing has changed, it feels like everything has changed. I just feel like a whole new sense of excitement and enthusiasm about what this year has in store for us and where my business is going. And it's all just super exciting. So it's been an interesting experiment of just observing how impactful these little things that might just feel like a tweak all of a sudden impact these other things that are kind of unconnected. My workload is basically the same right now, but somehow I all of a sudden have a whole different vibe about it. So if there's something in your life that's kind of like a thorn in your side, and then you decide to go and do something about it, you might be surprised at all the little ripple effects of that. And I love looking at stuff like that and just kind of being in that observational space. If you get into meditation and stuff like that, I feel like that's one of the things for me anyways that I can tell is different when I'm regularly meditating, as I really feel so much more of this non-attachment and observational energy toward everything that's going on in my life, even something that involves me. I can be like, oh wow, I got really pissed off about that. Oh, interesting. So anywho, welcome into this episode. We're not actually talking about assistance or ripple effects or any of that stuff today, although I guess maybe you could say that we are talking about ripple effects, because what we're going to talk about today is generational cycles, or sometimes people talk about generational trauma. It's this stuff that gets passed down from generation to generation, and it just if we're not bringing intention and awareness to it, we wind up accidentally, sort of perpetuating and repeating the experiences and the wounding that we experienced when we were kids. And I'm going to give you a funny confession around this week. Trust me, we could go in a totally different direction, but that would just be like a big buzzkill and bum everybody out. So I'm not going to go there today. But I am going to talk to you about a funny way. And sometimes these lighter versions of these, or lighter examples, are 10 times more impactful because they're so much less painful that we're actually able to notice them and work with them and be with them and stuff like that. So actually, even though this is a light and kind of goofy story or confession for you, I would say this might be one of the times when I started to notice how impactful my childhood was on my parenting, because it wasn't that big of a deal. And so I was able to actually kind of be with it and notice it and watch it and maybe have that observational mindset about it. So I had a really tumultuous childhood with my parents. My parents are really, really competent at adulting, but not at the emotional side of that stuff. And so lots of anger and yelling and judgment and shame and all of those sort of emotional attunement piece of the puzzle was not there. So I would say, if you remember all these times I talk about authoritative parenting, which is that a parenting that has the high degree of emotional attunement and a high degree of control and leadership. So meaning this authoritative parent that we're striving to be is somebody who has really great, healthy, disciplined skills and boundaries with their kiddo, plus a lot of emotional attunement, empathy, compassion, all of that stuff. That's authoritative parenting. And if you're only really nailing it in one department, you're really good at the control and leadership part, you're basically kind of a strict parent and you got lots of boundaries and rules and punishment and all that stuff, but not really great in the empathy and emotional attunement piece. And instead of being an authoritative parent, you are an authoritarian parent. Sometimes we call that like the drill sergeant parent. Love and Logic likes to use that word, or the dictator parent, or the tyrannical parent, or the punitive parent, or whatever. And that would be the kind of quadrant that my parents fell into. And so lots of really fun, like I said, painful avenues and rabbit holes we could go down with that. But one of the things that came out of my childhood that I actually think is a blessing, and truly, I really do say that. I'm not just, trying to put a silver lining on it or something, put lipstick on a pig or something like that. One of the beautiful things that came out of my experience of my childhood was an extreme commitment to parenting with integrity. And before I ever had kids, I had already decided, I know that there is a way to do this that feels different than what I experienced, and I will not rest until I figure it out. And so I'm really like grateful that I had that experience that gave me that commitment and dedication. And I really do feel like I have done a lot to break some generational cycles. I'm sure I've started other generational cycles, and time will tell on that. But so but early on in my parenting, the way that I sort of embodied that commitment was basically to just say, like, I'm not going to be like my parents. I'm going to do everything differently. I'm not going to, yell. I'm not going to lose my temper. I'm not going to spank my kids. I'm not going to, whatever. And I basically, if it was something that my parents did, I wasn't going to do it. And I did not realize how like extremely I had like, dug my heels in on that decision until my first kid was probably like, I don't know, maybe like a year old or something like that. The age where kids start doing like finger foods that aren't like, it's not like goo that you have to feed your kid, but more like actual, like, oh, you can put some like, little finger foods on their plate, like cut up grapes and, little chunks of avocado and stuff like that. And everybody, if you're out there listening to this and you've gone through this stage of life, you're probably thinking, why didn't she say Cheerios? Everyone puts Cheerios on their kids. Cheerios are like the easiest baby food on the planet. Just buy some Cheerios. You have amazing baby food. Now, obviously, there's people who would disagree with that and they would go a different route and organic stuff. But like, anyways, Cheerios, I refused to feed my kid Cheerios. And I didn't even realize at first that I was doing that. But like, we had all the other typical, like, chopped up bananas, and I would buy like the little baby food at the grocery store that was like dehydrated little bits of yogurt, or like the Zwayback cookies and stuff like that. Like all of those things, I would not buy Cheerios. And then, I don't know, I was like on a play date or something like that with a friend, and her kid had Cheerios. She's like, how come you never have Cheerios? And it wasn't until someone asked me that question that I actually had to say out loud and confront the truth, which is the real reason why I didn't have Cheerios was because my mom used Cheerios. I remember, because I'm the oldest and my sisters are a decent amount younger than I am. I remember them having like a little Tupperware full of Cheerios. And it was a memory from my childhood. And memories from my childhood are like, no, thank you to me. And so even something as benign as feeding your kid Cheerios had just gotten lumped in my mind into this, like, not doing it. Brings up icky feelings. The second I look at a little Tupperware full of Cheerios, it makes me want to cry. I don't even know. Didn't know that was what was happening. I didn't know it. It was just more just like I'm in the grocery store and there's no way that I would be drawn to buying Cheerios for my toddler. And until that friend asked me, like, how could I never have Cheerios for Elijah? I really, that was all just happening. It was just, I'm telling you this now with like this awareness and insight, and it sounds preposterous, but I didn't know that that's what I was doing. I didn't even know that I had decided not to do Cheerios. I just had this sort of like conditioned response to stuff that was reminiscent of me being a little girl. I just was sort of like, no, I would move away from that kind of thing. And so until I said it out loud, I didn't realize like that was why I hadn't bought Cheerios for my kid, and that I really wasn't done. I hadn't even begun my work on myself, having this conviction of like it ain't going down that way for my family. That's cool. And I, like I said, I'm really grateful that I had that feeling. And it's a big piece of why I parent the way I do and why I do the work that I do professionally, is because of that commitment that I had even before I left the nest, of like, it ain't going down this way. But that's the beginning. That was only the beginning. Yeah, it wasn't the conclusion. Maybe that I had felt like, okay, I figured it out. It ain't going down this way. I'm gonna, be different. And then I had thought probably before that moment that like, that's it. That was my conclusion. That's the conclusion I drew from my childhood, is it ain't going down that way. Done. And until I had this conversation about the stupidest thing on the planet, Cheerio to Cheerio or not Cheerio. Before I had that conversation, I really didn't take it further in my mind than it ain't going down that way. Until that conversation, I really did not fully understand like, whoa, this is stuff is there's layers to this onion. And so that's what I want to talk about today, is that like, how do we have that conviction and do something that truly does break a generational cycle with it, instead of have that conviction and then at some point down the line in our parenting realize like, oh my gosh, I accidentally have recreated the stuff that I was trying to run from. Because that's what happens. If we only parent with the conviction that it's going to be different, that we're going to be different, the buck stops here, but we don't do the work to really unpack that and come at this from a different lens, it doesn't matter how sure you were that you weren't going to parent the way that your parents did, or that you weren't going to transmit to your children the stuff that was transmitted to you. You almost can't help it. It just happens. It's like something that's just like energetically in the air, and our kids absorb it. And that like dogmatic rigidity that I was bringing to, ain't no fucking way I'm buying my kid Cheerios. That is a lot of the essence of my experience in childhood. So cool, my kid wasn't going to have Cheerios, but he was still going to have a really rigid, angry, frustrated, and emotionally stunted parent. And the fact that he never got Cheerios is not the thing that would break the cycle. So let's talk about that today. So this all came back into my mind recently because I've talked about generational cycles in different ways. Like if you go back and listen to my episodes on codependency, if you're on my email list, or if you go to my website and read the blog, there's a couple blog posts about codependency, and I talk about, how that is a generational wound that we pass along and things like that. So this isn't the first time I've talked about it, but it all kind of came back to me in a group call a couple of weeks ago, when a mom who was talking about watching her sons, her little brothers there fighting with each other, and that it was just really, really bothering her so much, and she wanted to do something about it. And I asked her, why is it so important to you? And this is why, for any of my coaching students out there, this is why it's so important to do a really thorough coaching agreement with your client at the beginning of a session, because one of the questions we ask during the coaching agreement is, why is it really important to you to resolve this issue? And when I asked my client that question, she said, well, their dad, my kid's dad, doesn't have a relationship with his siblings, and his parents also don't speak to their siblings. And I just really don't want that to happen here. So I need to, really address the sibling rivalry and make them be friends and make them be kind to each other, so that this pattern doesn't keep going on. And as soon as she answered that question, I realized like, wow, this is actually pretty deep. This isn't just a matter of like, what do we do when our kids fight? Oh, here's what we do here. Turn to section 7 in your curriculum and read about sibling dynamics and do all the skills that are there. I mean, obviously, yes, do that too. But we can see that this situation for this mom is not just about what do you do when your kids are fighting, but what do I do with everything that is coming up inside of me when my kids are fighting? Because that's the trickiest thing about generational cycles. right? So, we want to break a cycle. Well, why did we ever come to that decision? Why would we even be aware about breaking a cycle? Why would we even having this conversation? Well, the way we've come to that decision is because we experience the cycle ourselves. We're victims of the cycle. And now we've come away from that cycle with a fear of being that way, of being the way that we were treated, or perpetuating that cycle. So fear and pain is the impetus for this decision we've made to break the cycle. We felt it. It was awful. We have pain there. We know how hard and how unhealthy that cycle is. And that's what inspires us, that leads us to our decision not to parent that way. Our motivation, that fear and pain, is what motivates us to do differently. But we also know, as just adults who are exploring all of this stuff and have more of an objective way of looking at things than only through our own lens of experience as children, we know that doing things out of fear or out of pain is self-sabotaging. It's not effective. When we're running away from something instead of running towards something, when fear is the motivator, when pain is the motivator, or protecting ourselves from pain is the motivator, whatever we implement is not going to work. And actually, we will end up perpetuating that cycle. So for this mom, she feels emotional pain when she sees her children fighting. Well, what are the cornerstones of effective parenting or effective discipline? If you're in my world and already working with me, this is like in module 1 of the curriculum. We talk about the foundations for effective parenting. What do we talk about? We talk about 4 huge things, but the one I'm going to hone in on right now is neutrality. Neutrality is the most important thing. When we get activated, when we are intense or emotional or upset, or even in a thrilled, we're proud, we're excited, we're giving this like positive reward or whatever, but we're bringing intensity and emotion to discipline, that negates everything. Neutrality is key. And then when we look at the other elements of effective parenting, we talk about like children need to be autonomous, and we try to control our children, it backfires. So being able to step back and allow our children to make bad decisions, even decisions to choose to behave in ways that are painful to us, like fighting with each other, right? That's another cornerstone. That's another foundational principle there. And then you start thinking about some of these other principles that are in those 4 foundations. When you think about those ideas about control. So the only person we have the ability or right to control is ourselves. Like, how hard is it to stop trying to control a situation that's causing us pain? It's so hard, because what we're doing when we experience that pain is we're just having a fight or flight response, right? We're trying to stop the thing that's painful to us. So if what our children is doing is painful to us, we can't abide by that principle of like, you know what, it's not in my control, right? Or how about that 4th principle that we see in those the foundation, that those foundational principles is understanding that experiences are the most effective teachers to our children. That instead of talking and bossing and lecturing and repeating ourselves, we need to step back and let our children make bad decisions so that they can experience the results of those decisions. Every single thing that I'm talking to you about that are the hallmarks of effective parenting are basically impossible when we are triggered by our kids' behavior. So you think about this mom, she's watching her kids do this thing that she has pain around, this feeling of like, they're not, this is it. This is the cycle happening all over again. They're not going to have a relationship when they grow up. They're going to be really hateful to each other and all of this stuff. That pain is surfacing for her. And what is she going to do with that? Oh, is she going to be neutral? Hell no. Is she going to step back and let her kids make mistakes and experiences the consequences of those mistakes? I mean, how can we even expect that of her? Is she going to sit there and be like, you know what? I'm not in control. I'm not going to try to control this situation. It's not for me to control my child. How could she possibly avoid having that urge to control the situation? Is she going to offer lots of choice and agency to her child so that her child gets to, be autonomous and dictate, his life? Come on. It's not even fair for us to have any of those expectations on our kids. So now we're in this like really tricky position as parents who are trying to break generational cycles. Okay, well, my fear and pain is what led me to make that decision. But I also know that when I am experiencing fear and pain, if fear and pain is my number one North Star motivator in my parenting, I am completely incapable of parenting in this new way that I've decided I'm going to parent in. I've decided it ain't going to go down that way for my family. I'm going to be this kind of a parent. But how did I reach that conclusion? With all these ingredients that preclude me from being that kind of a parent. That is a tricky position that almost every parent who is trying to break a generational cycle finds themselves in. So, what do we do with that? How do we have this dedication to this stops with me and not do it because we're afraid or wounded? And I love that idea of like running towards something versus running away from something. Like it has to be this shift that happens inside of us of I'm committed to this amazing new thing versus I'm running away from this horrible old thing. And that all has to do with our inner healing. And to me, this conversation, it can feel like an impossible situation, almost like, gosh, we're screwed before you even started because of the discomfort or pain of our childhood. We've reached this like place that's it's like a one of those like finger traps that you used to get when you had to go to the lame house when you're trick-or-treating and they didn't give out candy, they gave out like raisins and finger traps. You guys remember that? Anyway, it's like that. It's like the more you pull, the more you're stuck, right? But there's another way to look at this, which I think is just so beautiful. And it just really, it's almost like you just take, like, you zoom out to the level of like you're on the moon looking at Earth from a distance kind of perspective where you realize, like, this is actually another cycle that is present and available for us to follow. And it's happening, it's unfolding all over the world all the time for all people, which is experiencing hardship, being inspired maybe or catalyzed by that hardship. And then what do you do with that hardship? And can we see it as almost like this fertilizer or ingredients for us to grow? And I know there's like, I'm sure I'm going to butcher it because it's not really part of my usual repertoire, but I know there's an experience, there's an expression out there that's kind of like, fertilizer is, it's duty, but then from that, something beautiful can grow. And that is the opportunity that this puts before us. But in order for us to really capitalize on that opportunity, we need to be dedicated not only to, I'm not going to be like my parents or, the cycle stops with me, but how the cycle stops with me is more than just me doing different. It's me being different. And in order for me to be different, I need to actually be open to the idea that I'm actually not different yet. Meaning I have all of those ingredients. So like, it's an old joke we all talk about, like, if they really want to make a woman mad, tell her that she's acting like her mother, right? That is definitely true in my family. That is like off limits statement in my marriage. But the reason why it's so activating for me is because like I feel those little ingredients of how my parents used to behave in me. Absolutely. Like I am a fiery, rage filled person, and it is absolutely just a hop, skip, and a jump from where I am now to being just an absolute viper of a human. That is in me, and I know it's in me. I feel it. And you know, being able to acknowledge, which was hard for me to do when I was younger, hence the Cheerios. Being able to acknowledge, like, yeah, it's really cool that you think you're different, but you ain't actually different. You've got all that stuff stewing and brewing inside of you. And if you really want to be different, you got to get in there and, muck around in that quagmire of, toxic ingredients that, you absorbed. and actually do some of that inner work, right? So if we do our own work, those little pain points don't get activated every time something happens that could be rekindling the cycle. So when this mom, does her work with me, and she also has other things that she's doing, at a certain point, watching her kids do this thing that could be rekindling that cycle of sibling schism, which is just having sibling rivalry and fighting because they're children right now. That doesn't have to be something that activates this worry, this like big picture fear that she has. And, then, as that happens, those things that are reminiscent of our old pain don't bring that up so much. We don't lose our conviction to show up well. It's not like because the pain is gone, now I'm not committed to, parenting in this new way. The conviction is there. The commitment is never lessened. What does make it different is that it makes it more possible for you to do the thing you're committed to doing because you're not being motivated by fear and pain. So that trust that I don't actually need to hold on to the anger or the story about how awful my childhood was or how unhealthy these kinds of parenting behaviors were and all of that stuff. I can actually let go of that because what's not going to ever leave me is my dedication to parenting well. I'm always going to have that no matter how much healing I have around my past. But the more healing I do have, the more amazing I am as a parent. And, this is why I think coaching is so important. Is why so many parents that hire me have already read a million parenting books. And I mean, I just cleaned out my self-help library, and it just so many books. The Dance of Anger. It's not even just about parenting. Like if you look behind me, if you're watching the YouTube video, you'll see like, oh, Brainstorm, Parenting with Love and Logic. I mean, I got a whole bunch of, I'm just reading them right now in my camera, books that are all about parenting, but there's just as many books that are just all about like me, my stuff. I love Eckhart Tolle. All of these books, right? You're probably just like me, and almost all my clients are. We've already read all the parenting books, or we've already read, Jen Sincero or Brene Brown, all of that stuff. It's not like we're not aware that there's a better way to be or a better way to behave, but the stuff that's inside us is still in there. And that's why we have to actually do something at the source. We need to go in and actually address the impetus, all of those ingredients that we absorbed when we were kids, so that we're not just reading a book about how we wish we were and never quite getting there. We're actually doing the internal stuff of, giving our system what it needs in order to truly be in a different state and sort of just literally vibrating in a new frequency. It's not like the conclusion of this coaching session with this mom was stop being afraid when you watch your kids fight. That's not going to work. How many times have you might have be able to identify like, oh, okay, I see this pattern. So I just need to not feel that way when this thing happens, What if we were able to say, well, you know what? I'd love not to be afraid. And I could see how not being afraid would make me be so much less reactive and show up as such a much better parent in this moment. I get all that. But the truth is I am afraid, even though I know it's not serving me and it might be getting in the way. So what do I want to do about that fear? Instead of get out of here, fear, because you're getting in the way. It's like actually the fear is the thing that needs the most attention of all. It's not the thing we push to the side so that we can get back to the business of parenting. Dealing with that fear is the business of parenting. Dealing with whatever we're still carrying, that is the business of parenting. That is breaking generational cycles. And that's why I think my clients that work with me start to see amazing results, even if they've read thousands of parenting books before they hired me. It's having somebody that helps you look at, okay, so still lost your temper when your kids were fighting, even though, you understand this whole pattern. Let's talk about what was going on there. And probably the rest of that session, we're not even talking about your kids. because what we're really talking about is let's talk about all the parts of you and what they're saying and doing and how they're interacting with each other and what that looks like on the outside, and how we can give all of those parts just love, compassion, listening to those parts with curiosity, giving them space to exist, not eradicating them, not pushing them to the side. That, in my opinion, is the business of parenting. And not only is it the business of parenting, and here's where my Ania type oneness comes out. For me, it is the sacred duty of parenting is for us to address these things, even if it's hard, even if it's something that's been passed down to us for, infinite generations, even if the stuff that we're dealing with isn't our fault and we shouldn't have it been placed on our shoulders, all of that stuff. Once we decide to have kids, we have taken on that responsibility, whether we like it or not. Now, some people don't actually, undertake that work, and that's when those cycles perpetuate. But most of the people, if you're still listening to this episode, I doubt that you're the kind of person who just doesn't take up that mantle. It sounds to me, or I'm guessing, that you are the kind of person who is hoping to and wanting to take that mantle up and maybe just needs a little help at figuring out exactly how do you do that. And that's my job. It's my job to help you explore that stuff, to find out what your system needs to feel differently, experience the world differently, experience your child differently, and really actually make it happen. So if that sounds like you, if this is interesting to you, if it's inspiring you, we should be talking. Let's have a dialogue instead of listening to me monologue. I want to hear from you. So I really encourage you to set up the discovery call, that consultation that you hear me talk about every week on the podcast, that opportunity for us to sit down and have a one-on-one conversation where you tell me exactly what I need to know about you. I ask really thoughtful questions that help kind of dig a little bit behind the surface, and we figure this out. We create a beautiful plan for things to go differently. And even if you don't end up working with me after that, almost everybody leaves that consultation just feeling a little lighter, a little more understood, a little less maybe of that inner critic and self-doubt that we carry around as parents, and maybe a little inspiration and hope of as to what can happen next. So I really look forward to your name popping up on my calendar, and I will talk to you again next week, everybody. Bye. The episode is over, but there's more waiting for you. You can grab my free workbook, Getting Kids to Listen the First Time, that walks you through the fundamental principles I teach all of my clients and applies them to this very universal parenting challenge. So if you're sick of repeating yourself all day long or just want to learn more about my style, you'll definitely want to go to bit.ly/kidswholisten. And if you're ready to work with me, let's meet. Set up a free call at bit.ly/KaplanCall, and let's create an action plan that gets you exactly where you want to go. And of course, links to all this goodness are in the show notes. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.